The gallery buzzed with an energy only a high-profile art show could generate. Rich patrons, art critics, and local celebrities milled around, sipping champagne and discussing the various pieces adorning the pristine white walls. The lights gleamed off the polished floors, casting reflections of the artwork in all directions. It was an environment where the elite came to judge, purchase, and gloat, surrounded by beauty that held no bounds. But amidst this world of high culture, one figure stood out, largely unnoticed, the young black artist, Darnell Avery. Darnell had always dreamed of being in a gallery like this, his name whispered in the circles of prestigious art lovers and influencers. His works had a raw, vibrant energy, paintings that captured the emotion and struggles of everyday people, yet there was an elegance in his brushstrokes that could not be denied. His pieces told stories that felt both timeless and contemporary, a fusion of abstraction and realism. Each of his works was a journey, one that invited the viewer to look deeper and understand what was beneath the surface. It was art that demanded attention, but often, it wasn't given. Standing before his latest collection, Darnell marveled at the energy of the room. He had fought to have his work displayed here, pushing through rejection after rejection. Galleries like this one, the prestigious Hamilton and Sons, were not known for taking risks. They preferred to showcase art that aligned with the well-established tastes of their wealthy clientele. Darnell's style, bold and unapologetic, wasn't always appreciated by the art world's elite. Yet here he was, part of the show. It should have been a victory. The gallery owner, Charles Hamilton, was a man whose name was synonymous with taste, wealth, and power in the art world. He was a tall, imposing figure, with graying hair slicked back into a perfect comb-over. His suit was tailored to perfection, his posture impeccable, and his smile practiced. He was the kind of man who never had to raise his voice to command attention. His reputation alone was enough to get people to bend to his will, to respect his judgment. Charles Hamilton was the gatekeeper, and to enter the world he controlled, one had to prove they were worthy. But to Darnell, Hamilton's world felt stifling. It was a world where his blackness, his identity, could only be tolerated if it fit neatly into the parameters of what the gallery wanted to sell. Darnell had seen this before, art critics nodding politely at his work, then moving on to something more familiar, something safe. In a room full of the city's elite, it wasn't lost on him that he was one of the only black faces present. He had fought for his place here, but even now, he could feel the weight of the room's skepticism. As the evening wore on, Darnell made his way toward the center of the room, where Charles Hamilton stood, surrounded by a small circle of patrons. Hamilton was mid-conversation with an older couple, praising their taste in collecting rare pieces. Darnell took a deep breath and approached the group, his heart pounding in his chest. "Ah, Mr. Avery, there you are," Hamilton said, his voice smooth as velvet, though there was a certain disinterested air in his tone. He turned slightly to give Darnell a nod, his eyes glancing briefly at the young artist's collection before returning to the conversation. "This piece here, the one with the deep reds and blues, interesting, but a little chaotic for my taste. Couldn't imagine it hanging in the living room of any of my clients." Darnell smiled politely, but inside, a fire was beginning to stir. He had heard this before, the dismissive comments, the shallow assessments of his work. Hamilton's words were not new, but they stung all the same. The painting in question was his latest piece, a powerful abstract portrayal of urban life, a reflection of struggle, resilience, and hope. It was one of his favorites, but to Hamilton, it was just another piece of chaos. "Well, art is supposed to evoke a reaction, right?" Darnell said, his voice steady but carrying an edge of defiance. "It's not about comfort. It's about truth." Hamilton chuckled, a knowing, condescending smile crossing his face. Of course," he said, waving his hand dismissively. "Truth is subjective, my dear boy. But the truth of the art world? That's something else entirely. You'll learn that soon enough." He looked over Darnell's head, signaling to his assistant to bring him another glass of wine. Darnell's smile faltered, but he refused to let it break. He had spent years honing his craft, pouring his soul into every stroke of paint, and yet it seemed that the world Hamilton inhabited would never truly see him for what he was. A black artist, struggling to break into a space that wasn't made for him. Hamilton continued, his attention now diverted to another piece on the wall. "You know," he said, "I do appreciate your dedication. But I think a few more years in the art scene will help you refine your work. Maybe then, we can talk business." His tone was dismissive, as if he were offering Darnell a rare favor. "I'm sure that's true," Darnell said quietly. He wanted to argue, to call out the pretentiousness in Hamilton's voice, but he held back. He knew how these encounters went. One wrong move, one misstep, and he could be labeled as difficult, as too much for their world. Just as Darnell was about to excuse himself, Hamilton turned back to him, his gaze sharpening. "Tell me, how do you plan on selling these pieces? The art world isn't kind to, let's say, experimental artists. You might need to rethink your approach." The words were loaded, a thinly veiled jab at his unrefined, primitive style. Hamilton clearly didn't see the value in the raw power of Darnell's work, he saw only an opportunity to offer a polite dismissal, knowing that no one would question his judgment. But Darnell, for all his restraint, couldn't ignore the slight. "I'm not worried about selling," he said, his voice cool. "My work speaks for itself. People will come around." Hamilton raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. He smiled thinly. "That's what they all say." He patted Darnell on the back, but it felt more like a patronizing gesture than a genuine compliment. "Well, good luck, Mr. Avery. I'll be sure to keep an eye on your future, though I suspect you'll find yourself, how do I put this, a bit out of your depth in this crowd." The word stung more than Darnell expected. But he stood tall, nodded, and stepped away. He could feel the eyes of the room on him, but he refused to let them see the fury building inside. He was used to this, used to being underestimated. What Hamilton didn't know was that this wasn't just some hobby for Darnell. This was his life, his passion, his future. He didn't need the approval of men like Hamilton. If anything, it was their dismissive attitude that fueled him. As Darnell left the gathering that evening, the weight of Hamilton's words hung over him. But there was a fire in his chest, a determination that only grew stronger with every sneer and dismissal. He would show them all. The next few weeks unfolded in a haze for Darnell. The rejection from Hamilton and Sons had stung, but it hadn't crushed him. If anything, it had solidified his resolve. He spent his days in his studio, working tirelessly, pouring himself into the paintings that spoke truths he knew few would understand. The struggle, the resilience, the defiance, it all bled onto the canvas in vibrant swathes of color. But while Darnell's days were consumed with his art, his nights were filled with something else, secrecy. No one in the art world knew who Darnell truly was, not the wealthy patrons, not the critics, not even Hamilton. The truth was, Darnell wasn't just a struggling artist trying to find his place in a world that was slow to embrace him. He was a man who had already earned his place, who had already proven himself, only in another world, one far more exclusive than Hamilton's gallery could ever be. Darnell had made his fortune years ago, selling his work in underground art auctions, behind closed doors where only the most elite buyers were allowed access. His art had been sought after by some of the most powerful figures in the world, billionaires, collectors, and even governments. His pieces were hidden in private collections across the globe, quietly appreciating in value. What Hamilton didn't know, what no one knew, was that Darnell had long since moved beyond the realm of struggling artist. He was now one of the biggest art buyers in the world. It had been a decision born of frustration, the constant rejection, the constant belittlement by people like Hamilton. So, Darnell had quietly invested in his future, acquiring pieces of art from every corner of the world. He had built relationships with the most renowned artists, attended exclusive auctions, and quickly gained the reputation of a man who knew the value of art, not just its surface appeal. The art world had seen him as a quiet, unknown figure, but that was exactly how he wanted it. He knew that to succeed in this game, he needed to play it on his own terms. The art world was filled with gatekeepers like Charles Hamilton, men and women who believed their wealth and prestige gave them the power to define what was valuable. But Darnell had learned long ago that true value wasn't something that could be determined by a price tag or an approval stamp. It was something deeper, something that transcended galleries and auction houses. And now, he was ready to take that power back. It was a late evening when Darnell received the call. He had been working on a new painting, his brushstrokes moving faster than usual, his mind focused solely on the canvas in front of him. The phone rang, the sound of it slicing through the silence like an intrusion. He glanced at the screen and saw an unknown number. Normally, he would have let it go to voicemail, but something told him he needed to answer. "Mr. Avery?" The voice on the other end was smooth, professional, and unmistakably familiar. It was Charles Hamilton. "I'm listening," Darnell said, his voice calm, betraying none of the surprise he felt. "I've been thinking," Hamilton began, his tone cautious, almost as if he were treading carefully. "About your work. The pieces you showed at the gallery. I have to admit, I was wrong about you." Darnell's mind raced. Wrong? The man had spent the better part of their last conversation belittling him, dismissing him as an artist with no place in the world of high culture. Now, after weeks of silence, Hamilton was calling, seemingly offering an apology. "I think your work has potential," Hamilton continued. "And I may have some buyers interested in it. The art world, you know, it can be unpredictable. I was too quick to judge." Darnell's lips curved into a faint smile. It was exactly what he had expected, a sudden shift in tone, an attempt to salvage his reputation with someone who held power in the art world. The same man who had dismissed him weeks ago now wanted to cash in on his success. But Darnell wasn't interested in the flattery. He wasn't interested in Hamilton's approval. He was playing a different game now. "I'm glad you've come around, Charles," Darnell said, his voice polite but distant. "But I've moved on from that world." Hamilton's voice tightened. "What do you mean?" "I'm offering you an opportunity, Avery. This is your chance to be recognized. Think about the prestige, the connections." "I've already thought about it," Darnell interrupted, his tone firm. "I've built something more valuable than your gallery could ever offer. I don't need your connections, and I don't need your approval. I've already found my place in the art world." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Darnell could practically hear Hamilton's mind spinning as he processed the words. Finally, Hamilton spoke, his voice cold and calculating. "Then I'll be honest with you, Avery. I think you're making a mistake. There's a lot of money to be made here, and you're turning your back on it. But if you're set on this path, I can't stop you." "I'm not in it for the money, Charles," Darnell said, his voice soft but resolute. "I'm in it for the art." Another long pause. Hamilton seemed to be gathering his thoughts, his pride beginning to fray at the edges. "Well, I'll leave you to it then," he said, his voice clipped. "But just remember, Avery, you could have been part of something bigger." "I already am," Darnell replied, his voice steady. "Goodbye, Charles." He hung up the phone, feeling a sense of finality. This was it, the moment where he truly separated himself from the world Hamilton had tried to control. Darnell was no longer the struggling artist at the mercy of others. He was a force unto himself, and soon, the world would understand just how far his influence extended. As he stood in his studio, looking over his latest works, Darnell smiled. It was only a matter of time before the world realized that the real power didn't lie in the hands of the gatekeepers, it lay in the hands of the artists who were bold enough to claim it. And Darnell Avery was ready to claim it all. It was an early afternoon when the final blow came. Darnell had barely settled into his usual routine of painting when the call came through. It wasn't from Charles Hamilton this time, though it might as well have been. The caller was an assistant working under Hamilton, a young woman named Claire. She was polite, professional, and clearly uncomfortable with the news she had to deliver. "Mr. Avery," Claire began, her voice soft but direct. "I wanted to inform you that after careful consideration, Hamilton and Sons will not be moving forward with displaying your work at the gallery. Charles, Mr. Hamilton, felt that your pieces, while certainly passionate, do not align with the direction of the gallery at this time. Darnell stood still, his brush hovering in midair as the words sunk in. He had known this moment might come. In fact, he'd been expecting it. But hearing it out loud, from the polished mouth of Hamilton's assistant, was something else entirely. The dismissive tone of the art world, the subtle rejection of his style, the unspoken limitations placed on him because of who he was, it all felt so painfully familiar. "I see," Darnell said, his voice steady. He had to keep it steady. His pride, his ego, would not break now. "And is there a specific reason why? I thought we had an agreement." Mr. Hamilton said, "The market isn't ready for your kind of work right now. It's not marketable enough for the kind of clientele we usually attract. He's just not comfortable taking that kind of risk." Claire's words were rehearsed, almost as if they had been carefully scripted for this exact moment. She wasn't delivering the bad news with any malice, but her message was as sharp as a knife. "Not marketable enough," Darnell repeated quietly, the bitterness creeping into his voice before he could stop it. "And here I thought the art world was about creativity, not just profit." Claire hesitated, then sighed. "I'm really sorry, Mr. Avery. I know this is disappointing. But please understand that this is business. Mr. Hamilton feels that, well, you're just not the right fit for his gallery at this time. If you'd like, he's happy to meet with you at a later date, perhaps to discuss future projects." Darnell gripped the phone tighter, his knuckles whitening. A part of him wanted to lash out, to tell Claire exactly what he thought of Hamilton and the elitist, superficial world he represented. But he didn't. He had learned long ago that anger in moments like this only made one appear petty. And he wasn't petty. "I understand," Darnell said, forcing the words out with precision. "Thank you for the call, Claire." "Of course," she replied, and with a final, apologetic tone, she hung up. The silence that followed was deafening. Darnell stood in his studio, the soft hum of the lights above the only sound, as his mind worked through the rejection. He didn't want to admit it, but the sting was real. For all his resolve, for all the quiet confidence he had built over the years, being turned away like this still hurt. But there was no time to wallow in it. He had learned long ago that self-pity was a luxury few could afford, especially in a world like his, where rejection was a constant companion. Instead, Darnell set the phone down and walked across the room to his latest painting. It was a chaotic piece, full of vibrant, swirling colors. It told the story of struggle, a reflection of urban life, of people fighting for their place in a world that often didn't want them. The piece was intense, full of raw emotion. And it was everything Hamilton had rejected. He stared at it for a long moment, feeling a strange sense of defiance rise within him. This painting was everything he was, everything he believed in. And if the world wasn't ready for it, if Hamilton and his elite circle weren't ready for it, then that was their loss. Darnell picked up his brush and dipped it into the paint, adding a few more bold strokes to the canvas. He had always known that the art world wasn't kind to those who were different. It wasn't kind to those who didn't fit its neatly constructed mold of what was acceptable. But he wasn't going to conform. Not for anyone. Not for Hamilton, not for anyone who saw his work as primitive or unsophisticated. His phone buzzed again. Darnell glanced at the screen. It was another number he didn't recognize, but something in him told him to answer. "Mr. Avery?" The voice was deep, unfamiliar. "This is Frank Harris. I'm with the Sotheby's auction house. I came across some of your work recently, and I must say, I'm thoroughly impressed." Darnell paused, his heart skipping a beat. Sotheby's? The prestigious auction house, known for dealing in multimillion-dollar pieces? He had been to their events before, but never as a buyer. "Mr. Harris," Darnell said cautiously. "How can I help you?" "I'd like to discuss the possibility of including some of your pieces in our upcoming auction. I've seen a lot of art, but your work, It speaks to something much deeper than what I've seen in the galleries lately. I believe it could make a huge impact. Darnell's breath caught in his throat. This was unexpected, to say the least. For the past few years, he had been working in the shadows of the art world, quietly collecting pieces that had slipped through the cracks. But now, someone at one of the most prestigious auction houses was recognizing his value. "I'm interested," Darnell said, his voice steady despite the surge of excitement. "Let's discuss the details." As the conversation continued, Darnell's mind began to race. This was it, the opportunity he had been waiting for. It wasn't from Hamilton, and it wasn't from the world that had rejected him. It was from someone who saw the value in his work, who recognized its depth and potential. By the time the call ended, Darnell was already thinking about the future, about how he would use this newfound opportunity. He had a choice to make. He could remain in the world of rejection, fighting for validation from people who would never understand his vision, or he could build his own path. He had already made his decision. He wasn't going to beg for a place in Hamilton's gallery. He wasn't going to seek approval from the people who had turned their backs on him. Instead, he was going to create his own legacy. Darnell took a final look at his painting, his eyes tracing the wild colors and patterns. There was no going back now. The world would know his name, whether it was ready for it or not. And so, with a renewed sense of purpose, Darnell began to prepare for the next step in his journey. The rejection he had faced that day would not be the end of his story. It would simply be the beginning. Darnell woke early the next morning, the weight of the conversation with Frank Harris still lingering in his mind. He hadn't expected an opportunity to come so soon, and he certainly hadn't expected it to come from someone outside of the traditional gallery circuit. Sotheby's wasn't just a name, it was the name in the world of high art auctions. And for someone like Darnell, who had lived in the shadows of that world, this was a chance to break free. He needed to make the most of it. The first step, of course, was deciding which pieces to bring to the auction. But he couldn't simply choose anything. He needed to choose the pieces that best represented the evolution of his work, the pieces that told the story of his journey from rejection to empowerment. He spent hours sifting through his collection of works, many of which had been quietly stashed away in his private studio for years. Some of the paintings were bold and abstract, others were more subdued and intimate, reflecting moments of personal growth and realization. But there was one piece in particular that stood out. It was a massive canvas, roughly 6 feet by 4, depicting a chaotic urban landscape. The swirling colors were almost violent in their intensity, blending together in a frenzy of shapes and figures. In the foreground, a lone figure stood tall, defiant against a backdrop of towering skyscrapers and a violent storm. The figure's eyes burned with resolve, a stark contrast to the cold, indifferent world around them. This was a piece that spoke not only of struggle, but of the triumph that could follow. This was the painting that Darnell knew would make a statement. It was everything he had wanted to say, everything he had experienced in his life. It was the embodiment of his journey, and he was certain that the right people would understand its power. He took a step back, his gaze fixed on the piece. For a moment, he allowed himself to imagine the look on the faces of those who would eventually see it, those who had rejected him, who had dismissed his work as unworthy. And then he imagined the buyers, the collectors, the ones who would see this and recognize its true value. They wouldn't just be buying a painting, they would be buying into something much larger, his story, his legacy. The next few days were a whirlwind of preparations. Darnell spoke with Frank Harris multiple times, fine-tuning the details of the upcoming auction. Harris was clear, Darnell's work would be displayed alongside some of the most prestigious artists in the world. There was no room for error. Darnell needed to make sure that every piece was presented in the best possible light. On the day of the auction, Darnell arrived at Sotheby's feeling both exhilarated and apprehensive. He had never been to an auction like this, never been on the other side of the gavel. The building itself was a testament to the exclusivity of the event. The grandiose marble floors, the elegant galleries, and the quiet buzz of anticipation all reminded him just how far removed he had been from this world. But he didn't feel out of place. he didn't feel like an outsider. As he walked through the hall, a sense of calm washed over him. This was his moment. For years, he had been forced to play the game of waiting, waiting for someone to recognize his worth, waiting for the right moment to make his mark. But now, the waiting was over. The time for action had arrived. He was no longer the artist on the outside, trying to break in. He was the artist with the power to shape the narrative. Soon, the auction began. Darnell stood at the back of the room, his eyes scanning the faces of the bidders as they surveyed the art. They were exactly as he had imagined, wealthy, polished, eager to claim the next great piece. But as they looked over his works, Darnell couldn't help but notice something that made him smile. They weren't just admiring the art, they were intrigued. The first piece to be put up for bidding was one of his more abstract works. It wasn't as bold as the massive urban painting, but it held a certain quiet intensity. The bidding started low, and Darnell watched as the price slowly climbed. He could hear the quiet murmurs of interest as the room began to take notice. And then, it was time for the piece, the one he had chosen to define his journey. The painting of the defiant figure standing tall against the urban storm. The room fell silent as it was revealed. For a long moment, no one moved. The room felt almost frozen in time as eyes locked onto the canvas. Darnell stood still, watching intently, heart pounding in his chest. Finally, the first bid was placed. And then another. The price skyrocketed faster than Darnell could have imagined, with multiple bidders fiercely competing for ownership of the piece. The auctioneer's voice rang through the room as the numbers continued to climb. But Darnell wasn't focused on the numbers. He was focused on something else, on the realization that, for the first time, his art was being recognized for what it truly was. It wasn't just another painting. It wasn't just a canvas covered in paint. It was a statement, a reflection of everything he had worked for. The bidding war raged on, and as the final gavel came down, the painting sold for an astronomical price, far higher than Darnell had expected. The room erupted in applause as the buyer, a wealthy European collector, claimed the piece. Darnell stood there, a slow smile spreading across his face. The world had just paid attention to his work in a way it never had before. It was then that Darnell realized something. This wasn't just about the money. Sure, the financial success was gratifying, but this was about something much deeper.